Thank you for watching Conscious Consumer Network. The live stream broadcast is free to view. You can pause and rewind live broadcasts to catch up, or view shows at a later date by accessing our free archives of all shows. Check out our broadcast guide to see what's on. You can show your support by donating to our network support fund. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, or subscribe to the monthly newsletter for updates. We thank you for supporting free and independent media.
This is For the Love of Learning, Voices of the Alternative Education Movement. Be inspired by the voices of visionaries, changemakers, and ordinary, extraordinary people who do what they do, all for the love of learning.
This is For the Love of Learning, Voices of the Alternative Education Movement. I'm Lainey Liberty.
And I'm Miro Siegel, and this is episode number 102. Tonight, we are going to talk about cross-cultural identities and third culture kids.
No generation before now has had so many of its members simultaneously living in between and among countless cultural worlds as is happening today.
What are third culture kids? First, we must understand how we are addressing cultural identification. The first culture generally is identified as being the home or passport holder culture, more often the same as the parents, but not always.
And the second culture is identified as all the places a child has lived.
Now, the third culture is identified as the shared lifestyle of the expatriate community. As early as the 1950s, people who had moved overseas for their careers, as opposed to immigrants, this tradition continued into the 21st century. Expatriates, also known as expats, form a lifestyle that is different from the host or home culture, but common to them all is the particular setting. A third culture kid is a person who has spent a significant part of his or her first 18 years of life accompanying parents into a country or countries outside of their passport country due to the parents' choice of work or elected travel.
So many have heard of TCK or third culture kids, but the term cross-culture kids or CCK isn't used quite as often. The CCK is a little different than the traditional TCK. According to Ruth Van Recken, quote, a cross-cultural kid, or CCK is a person who is living or has lived in or meaningfully interacted with two or more cultural environments for a significant period of time during their first 18 years of life, unquote.
The term cross-cultural kid is the umbrella name for many variations of CCKs, including domestic cross-cultural kid, bi-multicultural or bi-multiracial children, children of borderlanders, children of immigrants, children of minorities, children of refugees, international adoptees, and finally, educational cross-cultural kids.
And so you must be asking, why are these classifications important? Well, we feel, and we're going to talk about it tonight, that these classifications deal with identity development. So we've got a lot to talk about and a wonderful panel to explore these issues with. So let's jump right in. We're going to first read each of our panelists' bios, but I want to remind our audience you can find out more about each of our participants on the show notes page located at fortheloveoflearningshow.com, and look for the show notes page for episode number 102. There you will find more information about each of our panelists and links to their projects and websites.
First, we'd like to introduce Aaron and Ari Silver. Ari and Aaron Silver have been traveling in a variety of ways since leaving their San Francisco Bay Area home in 2007. They've lived in an 8,000 square foot mansion, a 150 square foot RV, and several homes and Airbnb since. They spent 2 years touring the U.S., living full-time in RV, having taken multiple trips to Mexico and Canada, and having backpacked and house sat through Italy, Greece, Turkey, England, and Ireland. Their entrepreneurial and self-directed learning, combined with nomadic and sometimes minimalist existence, means that there really is no one culture they identify with anymore. When asked where they are from, they still say California, but that is usually for politics and expediency rather than anything else, because they haven't lived there in nearly a decade. Instead, they consider themselves global citizens, absorbing what resonates from everywhere they go. Welcome to tonight's show, Ari and Aaron.
Hello. Hey, glad to be here. Yep.
We're so happy you're on the panel tonight too, and it's fabulous to have the perspective of people that are living the experience now. Next, I'd like to introduce you to Jane. Jane is an international intercultural transition specialist and culturally responsive educator driven to improve emotional, social, and educational outcomes for cross-cultural students and their families. Her experience as an educator of 24 years in both international and local schools, a parent of 2 cross-cultural children, a child of a domestically mobile family, and now a repatriate to Australia, inform her work. She has seen and understands the impact of moving across cultures upon individuals. Founder of Globally Grounded, Jane is dedicated to supporting students crossing cultures, their families, and those who educate them as they navigate through the triumphs and challenges associated with cross-cultural domestic and or international transitions. This may be from one country to another, or one state to another, or one city to another, or from one subculture to another, such as indigenous to non-indigenous, rural to urban, family home to boarding school, and vice versa. Jane consults to the international local schools, families, and students crossing cultures, developing their understanding of the impact of cross-cultural mobility, designing programs, and implementing support mechanisms to enhance learning and life. Jane's writing has been published in International Teacher Magazine, International School Magazine, and the International Educator, as she blogs at Globally Grounded. So welcome to tonight's show, Jane.
Thank you so much, Lainey. I'm looking forward to this so much. Looking forward to learning from everyone as well.
Fantastic. Well, then let's start the conversation with you, Jane. Can you please talk a little bit about why it's important to understand, first of all, how TCKs and CCKs are identified, but especially in the terms of how it affects learning, education, and personal identity development?
Yes, thanks, Lainey, so much. It is incredibly important. And I think what we're learning now, we know more than we've ever known before about families and students crossing cultures. And we understand the impact that that has. And getting to the core of exactly what you said in your introduction, it's all to do with personal or cultural identity. And that is important because that helps us know who we are as individuals. And if we know who we are as individuals, then that means that we have self-confidence in that, and that helps us to contribute to society. It also helps with our ability to learn also. So within the whole, you use the term cross-cultural kids as an umbrella term, and that's absolutely accurate because there are now so many different, it used to be just third culture kids, but now there are so many different variations on that theme that the term cross-cultural kids kind of covers everything and helps students to identify with possibly more than one type of mobile life.
So we're going to get into this a little bit later in the show, but I really want to dive into the idea of identities and identity development, and why that's so significant to a person, as you just said, how that's directly related to self-confidence and growing up knowing who you are in the world. Why is that? Well, I'll just ask you right now, why is that important?
Well, yeah, that's a really good question. Maybe some of the others can answer as well, because I'm sure they're exploring this as they go along. But it's at the very heart of who we are as human beings. It's very important for us to understand who we are as individuals, because if we don't understand that, it makes it very difficult for us to have an accurate or authentic lens with which to look at society, and that impacts our learning, it impacts the way we view life, it impacts our relationships with others, it impacts our spirituality, every single facet of our life. So it's in my opinion, it's incredibly important that we understand who we are, and at the very basis of that is our cultural identity, and that comes from our heritage, our cultural heritage, from our family. It also comes from all the places that we've lived in the world and the influences that we have on each individual person, and that can be different even within one family.
Yeah, it's so interesting. Thank you for that. And that was a beautiful introduction. And we're going to get into this a little deeper. I know there's so much to talk about, but why don't we jump on over to Ari and Aaron. And you guys, as Miro read your introduction, you guys have quite a bit of traveling in your background as well. And the interesting thing is you identify as being Californian, although you haven't lived there in 10 years. Why don't you guys talk about what your identity is in terms of, where you come from nationality and culturally, and what issues may or may not have come up as a result of your traveling or not having that singular country to call, that's your identity or your home.
All right. Well,
First, I'd like to start. The reason we identify as Californian, is that how you say it? Yeah.
yeah.
Is because that was where we were both born.
Yeah, both of us were born in California, so that's one of the facts that we both still to this day say, that we're technically, well, we are from California, but we do say that we're still Californian. It is because we both agree with mostly the political and national, well, not national, but the stance that California has on a lot of issues, more than we agree with anywhere else we've lived. Yeah. And so saying that as a form of introduction, I think expresses who we are. So if we say we're Californian to someone, then I hope they would assume,
Not assume.
Well, not assume.
But they will understand that we have a way of thinking about things.
Yeah.
That is very Californian.
Yeah.
Well, I'm laughing over here because we're Californians too, but it's funny, we don't say that. Well, I guess we do say we're California.
Yeah.
Before we get into that, thank you guys. Thank you. I'm going to ask you more questions. I'm going to ask you 10 more questions, but thank you for that. Before we move on, so those of you that have watched the show, this is 102 episodes, you guys have seen Miro pop in either as a panelist or a guest host, many, many shows, many times. And tonight he's serving as both my co-host and also as a panelist. Miro just turned 18 and has actually, those of you that know our story know that he left the States when he was only 10 years old. And so we haven't lived in our home country, nor have we actually identified with that. And you've been out of the country that you're from for almost half of your life now. And so for those of you that don't remember, I'm going to ask him to share just a teeny bit about his background. And then you can share a little bit about your own sort of cultural identity. And I think it might be interesting if you bring in the political and the all of the other things that make up your identity as who you are now. So
okay, so I mean, I'm sure as a lot of viewers know, my mom and I, we left the United States about 8 years ago now, just traveling through Central and South America, mainly Latin America, but we've actually also traveled to Asia, to different parts of Europe. We were just in Africa as well. But I think, and so after being outside the States for this long, for 8 years, I really don't identify as being American anymore. Obviously, people see me, and especially for Latin American countries, people see me and they're like, oh, it's a gringo, he's probably American. And yes, I do tell people that I am originally from the US because I don't want to deceive anybody. But if we're talking about identity and what I truly identify with in terms of a nationality, I guess that really depends on the person that I'm interacting with. I don't know if I actually have any kind of identification with a nationality. I know who I am as an individual. I don't think that anything about me is governed by my nationality. So, I mean, if we're in Latin American countries, I'll tell people that I'm Peruvian because I'd rather be perceived as being a Peruvian than as being an American. And a lot of that, as she said, does have to go into the political reasons and the, just the policy, the political reasons. But I think the whole thing for me is actually not even about how I self-identify, but how others identify me as a result of my nationality. And that's a really big aspect of it.
Yeah, and it's interesting. Thank you for that. And it's interesting that no human being lives in a vacuum. We live in relation to the world around us, and we live in relation to our immediate communities. And the way that we're perceived by people in our immediate communities oftentimes can be very different if it's not our home community. And that does inform, I believe, who we are. Yeah, and actually Jane asks a question, and I'm going to ask, this is Jane's question, and I'm going to ask Miro first, and then we're going to pop back on over to Ari and Aaron. The question Jane asks is, what does being a Californian actually mean?
I mean, that's interesting. As far as we're talking about, if we do go as far as to identify as an American, then in my own personal opinion, as they said earlier, I would actually much rather identify as being a Californian because it's more liberal on a lot of topics. It's more, I don't know, I want to say progressive, but I don't know if that's necessarily true. It's just, that's kind of perhaps the persona of the identification. And so, as long as, if I'm telling somebody that I am American, if I'm from the US, a part of me actually does take a little bit of comfort in saying that I am from California because it's almost as if, yes, it's this subculture within the American culture, but there's also this completely different persona. It's just this completely different thing. So I don't know. It's just another identity.
That's fascinating. Thank you so much, Miro, for sharing that. I'd love to hear what Ari and Aaron's perception is because not having ever lived in the States, although I visited quite a few times, I'm not familiar with what a Californian means. So I've already learned something, see, just in the first few minutes. So thank you.
Yeah, I do agree with the stance that California is more like, well, at least, well, I guess so. And at least the persona that it gives off seems more, progressive and liberal and stuff. And I mean, the U.S. as a whole is such a huge country. I mean, just saying you're from the U.S. doesn't give a lot on who you are as a person, and saying that you're from the U.S. Might give other people ideas about you that could possibly be wrong, considering the size of the country and the news that it puts out around the world. So yeah, I guess narrowing it down to California specifically as such a huge state and a well-known one for what it is, kind of gives more kind of, I'm trying to think of the word, insight into who you are as a person, I suppose.
I also think being raised in California means you're raised around things that can change your life. Like you're raised around the ocean.
Yeah.
You can go to the ocean. You are always right near water. There's a great community in California for the most part.
Yeah. I mean, it depends on where you are, but
Depends on
where we grew up.
Where we grew up, in California.
We were always near the water, and so that's always a huge part of our lives, is going to beaches wherever we go.
Yeah. And we always compare them to the ones in California.
The ones in California.
Because those are the ones we have memories of.
Yeah, very strong memories. So it's a place we have strong memories of, and so I don't think that's ever going to go away. I think it's the place that we relate the most to, and that we have the strongest memories of. So
we are Californian,
in a word.
You know what I find really, really interesting is, so the teens that are here on this panel have the option to identify with a place that they once identified with. But what about those, Jane, can you talk a little bit about those that don't have the option to identify? So for example, if they're from one country and moved to another country when they were very young, so let's say they were in Australia and moved to Singapore or Hong Kong, and now they're Hong Kong, and whether they identify with that culture or not, there's not even a choice to choose where they identify with, because that's where they've been placed by their circumstances. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure, absolutely. It's becoming more, we know more than we've ever known before. I think I said that earlier about children crossing cultures. And what we are finding is that if these students are not sure who they are as individuals and they're not supported to manage each of those transitions, it can cause a lot of problems later in life. They're just their inability to be able to identify with anyone. And the reason why that is important, like Ari and Aaron were talking before when they were talking about their links to California, it's about making connections. And that's what life is all about, isn't it? It's about making connections with other people, with other places, and also being able to be in relationship with other people. If you can't relate to another person, then that's going to make life really difficult for you. So having that connection therefore brings about a sense of belonging. And if you don't have that sense of belonging, it makes it very hard for you to know who you are. So it's kind of like a circle, it kind of goes around. So we are learning that mobility, if it's not managed, if children are moving between cultures often and it's not managed and they're not supported, that really can negatively impact upon the kids. Maybe not at that time, but as they become older as adults and they're trying to develop long-term relationships or trying to stay in a job for any length of time, commit to anything, that can be a real complication. So then there needs to be a real sense of belonging, a point at which you are happy just to be who you are and settle I think settle is a key word, actually. Settle with who you are as a person, settle within an environment, settle within a culture. Not permanently, it might not be permanently, but at least for a period of time.
We have a story
Slight story
that reminded us of.
Very strongly reminded me of.
We took a 6-month
trip to
a 6-month
trip to Europe, and we spent a month of that in Greece. And while we were there, we went down a few times and volunteered helping some of the refugees that were there. And a lot of them started learning English really fast. It was interesting talking to a few of them, but they started learning Greek
in order to
as soon as they got there, in order to help themselves, to help their families there get to a better place. And I don't think many of them were proud of the place that they came from anymore.
So they then identified as Greek citizens.
More than they did with their own countries, even though they had been there for not even like a week or two, but they had started learning the language. They had been accepted into this culture like without much hesitation, at least, and they were being helped out of a very hard time by, a lot of people, and I think
they were getting better lives.
Yeah,
they liked the new place they were,
and they identified with the place they were.
Happy.
They were happy with the place they were and decided to, I think, change from saying that they were from wherever they were from, and decided to say, I'm Greek now, and this is where I'm happier as a person, as a family, as people, rather than continuing to say that they were from a place that they didn't feel proud of being from anymore.
It's actually really interesting, and that kind of touches on something that I wanted to bring up and ask the panel. I wanted to ask the question of, what does shame have to do with cultural identification too? Where does that fall into play? And I know obviously in this scenario that they were just talking about, yes, there's a lot of trauma that comes with that as well, but that's not necessarily the case in all of the in all cases. So I simply want to ask, where does shame for your nationality come into play?
Wow, Miro, that is a big question. And I'm not a psychologist, so I'm not sure I can necessarily answer it from a clinical perspective. But what I can say is that shame/trauma, negative experience in any way, I guess, would be the blanket statement. Whilst it can be put under the carpet for now and possibly even ignored for a period of time, it is going to come up. And even the refugees that Ari and Aaron were talking about before will hopefully over time, as they adjust and learn the new language and work through that trauma, hopefully we'll get to a point of integration where they can be proud of their cultural heritage, possibly not the country that they've come from, but there's a lot of wonderful things in every culture, aren't there? And so being proud of who they are within that cultural heritage, but integrating it with the new culture that they're in, or all the new cultures that they're a part of, because really at the foundation of who we are, are our family values, and they are often based on our cultural heritage. So yes, in answer to your question, it's a big question, Miro. What do other people think?
We also have another story, actually, which is also related to the being Californian thing, which was when we were during this trip to Europe, we also went to Istanbul in Turkey,
and there you take a lot of taxis.
A lot of taxis. You don't go anywhere without a taxi, and they're very they like talking a lot since like there's traffic in Istanbul. So you spend a lot of time in the taxis, and so of course, like, you strike up a conversation, and a lot of them speak English. And they'll recognize, the American accent, and they'll ask, like, are you from the U.S.? And normally we'll say, yes, we're from California. But the one time that my mom said, yes, we're from the U.S., just in general, like the United States, immediately he went, oh, so what do you think about Trump? Literally the first thing that he said.
He just turned around and started talking to us about politics in America.
Yeah, like we had all the opinions that were seen in the news about it and such. So
luckily that was a short taxi ride.
Yeah. But yeah, so it comes back to identifying with a certain place for us specifically.
Sub-region.
Yeah, sub-region, a subculture, I suppose, specifically California for us. And then I guess it also leads into shame about our country occasionally when it's perceived as what it is by other people from other countries, going to other places and seeing the way that they respond to us saying that we're from that country, and then immediately hearing what they have to say about it is interesting.
Yeah.
Do you know what I'm picking up here with you guys? And I think it's so fantastic. I'm picking up with you, Miro, and also Ari and Aaron, this incredible ability to almost be a chameleon, depending on who your audience is. So before, Miro, you were talking about depending on who your audience is, you may identify with being from Peru when you're in South America. At other times you can be another person. Now this is a fantastic skill if used well, because it shows your ability to adapt, and it also shows your cultural competence, in my opinion, your ability to read the culture about you and the culture in which you're in at that point in time, and then work out how to behave and how and what is valued in that culture. So guys, well done, because this is such an important life skill, and obviously the lifestyle that you're leading and your mobility in between cultures and subcultures is helping you to refine that skill. Very important life skill.
Yeah, thank you for saying that, Jane. One of the things that I've written about a lot, and I work with teens in different places in the world, and one of the things that we talk about, and this isn't specifically a third culture kid issue, but if we're looking at the things that we're talking about as being a third culture kid, it's about identity from the inside out. And what I talk about with the teens that go to different countries and try and experience a different culture is how to experience a culture from the outside in. And what that ties into is worldviews. And so having the competency to identify when people who may be sitting across the table from you are seeing an object that's in front of you very differently than the way that you're seeing it, whether it's an object or a circumstance or an experience or a place or whatever. It's because the cultural relevance may be different. So being able to see an object, a thing, an event, a place, or a person through the lenses of other people's perspective is a really important skill to have. And Jean, I want to ask you, as somebody who works with third culture kids and these transitions, is there in your profession, in your professional experience, any attention given to the outside in perspective as well as the inside out perspective? And if there is, could you talk about that a little bit, please?
Yes, well, that's a very good question. I guess where I come from in my work is that the outside perspectives or the outside influences from all the cultures in which a child has lived. But I don't think that, in my opinion, you can't see things from other people's perspectives until you know who you are as a person. I think you need to identify with your own identity, because that helps you to understand the lens through which everyone else sees their own identities. So I think that the first step needs to be understanding who you are and your own identity, and then from there, that gives you the perspective to be able to look at things from other people's perspective, from the outside coming in. Have I answered that question correctly? Or
Go ahead, Meryl.
I actually just want to add on to that very, very briefly and just say my perspective is I think that sometimes it's actually physically and metaphorically impossible to see something from another person's perspective, at least completely. And I know that a lot of it has to do with you can at least empathize, and it comes into the whole sympathy and empathy conversation again. But I feel like, yes, it does certainly help understand where a person is coming from if you understand where you came from yourself as a person. And I mean, that should make sense. That's human nature. But at the same time, I also think there has to be a line where you can simply accept another person's experience, and where you can say that yes, that is that person's experience, but no matter what I do in my life, it's possible that I might never have an experience just like that. So I think it's also important to kind of draw the line in the sand where you can experience something and where you can accept that is somebody else's experience as well.
But I think it goes back to the competency that Jean was talking about, and being a cross-cultural kid, being somebody who is aware of different perspectives gives you that insight just a little bit more than somebody who has lived day one to the last day of their life in a singular country.
Definitely agree with that.
yes, absolutely. And I think the great thing is that we don't have to agree with each other. You know, we can appreciate someone else's perspective, and how do we learn about that perspective? Well, that's through communication, and that is a learned skill, how to learn to communicate in a culturally responsive way with individuals, because what works in one culture doesn't work in another, for example. But it's okay to agree to disagree. That's what makes the world go round, right?
This actually, another story time. While we were in Istanbul, of course, there are a lot of mosques there that some people would go to for their religious reasons, and then other people would go to take pictures of the architecture, as it's a historical building that has been there for a very long time. And we actually went there about 10 minutes before they closed the entire mosque and cleared people out for them to have a time to pray. And it was really interesting seeing some of the people, go in there, obviously being tourists with, cameras and phones and, looking like tourists. And then other people.
Khakis and Bahama shirts.
Well, yeah, they required you have skirts on past your ankles if you were a female, and have a scarf over your head for the reason that it was a religious building, but it was to them. But it was really interesting, seeing people actually go there for the reason that they believe it was made for, and then having other people go there, to have pictures of a historical building that is truly beautiful, but they might not believe the same reasons that it was there, that it was built in the first place.
Yeah, that's a really interesting observation, and it ties into a conversation, a long-standing conversation we've been having recently about the idea of being, a third, and again, I say third culture kid, but I also identify, can I say third culture adult? Can I say that? Can I say that? Yeah.
Absolutely, absolutely you can. An adult third culture kid or a third culture adult, absolutely. A member of a third culture family, however you want to put it.
Thank you for that. Well, so we talk about this quite often because we talk about being visiting locals, and there's a difference between being a visiting local versus being a tourist. When we go to a country, we don't live necessarily, sometimes we do, but necessarily in the smack of the center of a tourist zone and only have expat friends. We try and immerse ourselves into the culture and have that cultural experience. And whether we're there for 6 months or a year, it's much more significant than simply just, being a tourist or only hanging, out with expats or that sort of thing. Although in the description of the show, we talked about the third culture, which is the expat culture for many people, and that being the third culture, not of this country, not of the country they come from, but the culture that they make as an expat. But we try, as no matter how hard that we try, we will always be a visitor. We will always be an outsider. So that does place us in the third sort of cultural perspective. And the conversation that we have quite often is, and especially coming from the United States, and I don't know if Australia is as politically correct or sensitive in that sense, we talk about the concept of cultural appropriation quite often. Who has the right to adapt some of the cultural identities from our perspective, from a place of respect, because we're living there and we are immersed and we love it? Or is that a form of cultural appropriation that may or may not be accepted by somebody else? So, I mean, it's a big topic. The conversation started one day. My son actually, yeah, he's actually he was wearing a pair of fisherman pants that we bought in Thailand, and the question was, is he appropriating this culture by wearing a traditional, fisherman pant from Thailand? And so we talked about it and got deeper and deeper and deeper, and then the question is, well, what if I wear my beret? Am I culturally appropriating, the French, And it went from there. So actually, I want to bring this to the panel. It's an interesting topic, and it's not exactly about the topic that we're, third culture, kids, family, but it kind of is.
And I think it's more relevant. It's definitely more relevant to people living a third culture lifestyle, just in the sense that this kind of topic would come to the surface a lot more. It would be a larger part of our lives.
And it may not be necessarily about something superficial like clothes, but while we're in Peru, we participate in despacho ceremonies, which are the traditional blessings for Mother Earth. And we think it's a beautiful thing to do, to go with a shaman and make an offering and really honor the land that has been honored by the people whose country we were living in, whose land we were living in. And for us, it's called respect. It's with respect. But for others, they may say, you're white, you shouldn't be doing despacho ceremonies. Why are you doing this? You're culturally appropriating our traditions and somehow watering down the relevance somehow. So I just want to start this conversation and see if anybody has any thoughts or comments about that. So I'll open that up to the panel.
Wow. That's very interesting. And it is something, you're exactly right, Miro. It is something that comes up over and over again when you travel to different locations, and there are things that really resonate with you. And I think this comes back to our core values as well. You know, it's there. So for example, the ceremony that you were just talking about is something that obviously links with your core values as to who you are. So from your perspective, this is something that you really value and you want to be part of who you are. I think, I can't speak from the perspective of the culture that you were a part of, but I think as our world is becoming more and more globalized, identifying with one particular cultural identity is not feasible anymore. And I think that's certainly something that I have learned on my journey. When we moved to Singapore, for example, I was adamant that my children were going to retain their Australianness, you know, no matter what. It was so important to me. But within 6 months, I had a complete transformation where I suddenly realized that was my journey, but that's not their journey, and their journey needs to reflect all of their experiences and all the things that really resonate with them. And so they very much so identify with some of the Asian cultures in which they have lived and been immersed for periods of time. And yes, some of the clothing, and we still wear some of that clothing, but also way, way deeper than that. Some of the really fundamental parts of the culture are now part of their cultural identity. And I applaud that. I think that's fantastic. I think we all need to, you know, but it comes back to values. What does everyone else think?
Well, as for cultural appropriation, I once again have another story. Well, it's not much of a story as it is an experience for me as a female going to Turkey, which is a Muslim country where women traditionally cover their heads. I did not the entire time we were there, and I was actually told by the person whose hotel we were staying at. He was very nice, by the way. I think we're still friends with him.
We are. He was really nice.
Yeah, but I was told that it would actually be seen as insensitive if someone who was not Muslim was to cover their head and not, you know, mean it as you know, a part of the culture, only to just fit in, because there's trying to think of the word. It's not that. It was, but yeah, having not covered my head the entire time and not being looked at as odd, I think I would have been looked at, noticed more if I obviously had no idea what I was doing and was wearing it the entire time we were there, because
You're really pale.
That too. But yeah, the only time they made, well, not made, but they asked me to, was when we went into the mosque, where it was, you know, only respectful to. Otherwise, it would have been probably disrespectful to, as I'm not part of that part of their culture, and they would have been offended, most likely.
How I've personally kind of been able to reconcile this problem in my head. I personally, where I kind of draw the line for myself is knowing where it's important to separate things that come from a place of, I don't know, I want to say functionality, and places that come from a more sacred mindset. I think that cultural appropriation, in my eyes, really is only relevant when the term is applied to something that was once sacred to a culture, and it's kind of been taken, like you guys were just saying, for example, you know, wearing the headdress and not actually understanding the sacred aspect of it. So I think that, like, having respect for example, like it's the difference between wearing a bindi for a fashion statement and wearing a poncho, because I know that the Peruvian people, sure, there's a lot of tradition that goes into it, but they wear the poncho out of functionality. They wear the poncho because, it is a useful piece of clothing. The same goes for the Thai people with the fisherman pants. But when we're talking about, like, for example, things that have a lot more of a religious or more of a context in belief, I think that's where kind of the line needs to be drawn, I guess. But it's interesting. I can't really say.
And I think, Ari, what you were talking about were nuances that are so difficult to gauge and to get right, especially in the moment. But you were spot on with understanding that if it didn't feel like an authentic respect, then it would be an actual disrespect to kind of commodify.
Commodify.
That's not the right
gentrify.
word. That's a tough one. Yeah, I don't know.
Yes, that's really interesting, guys. I think, but what you are identifying is that you guys have very strong cultural competence, and that comes from the fact that you've lived in a variety of different cultures and you are respectful of that. We had a situation last year with some Australians. I don't know if it made it into the press in the neck of the woods where you are, but it was an incredibly embarrassing moment where some Australians went to Malaysia to the Malaysian Grand Prix, and they had some swimming costumes made with the with the Malaysian flag on them. So in Australia over the summer, you may have seen on television surf lifesavers who wear not very much when they are doing their surf rescuing, just like we call them budgie smugglers, or swimming costumes, not shorts. They're like undies, but they're swimming costumes, if that's making sense. These boys went over to the Malaysian Grand Prix, and when whoever it was they were going through, or maybe it was one of the Australian driver, won the Grand Prix, they all dropped their trousers and presented these swimming costumes with the Malaysian flag on them, which they thought was fantastic because they were honouring the country in which they were, but they didn't realise that that equated to exposing yourself in the Malaysian culture, and they found themselves in jail and for quite a few days. And yes, it was actually a major political and international incident between Malaysia and Australia. But it gets back to that whole point of understanding the culture where you are and being respectful of that, doing your research before you go. Miro, you were talking before about functionality versus spirituality or sacredness. And I think it's important that we understand that. And when we're going to another country or another culture or another subculture, we need to be informed before we go so that we can meet these people where they're at.
Although I would argue, as the experience that I shared about the despacho ceremony, I didn't want to feel as if I could not do it. I could not experience that part of the culture because it was sacred, but going into it with reverence and respect and, really, again, as it did align with my personal values, I felt it was okay. However, those that feel cultural appropriation, means, you don't have the right as a gringo to go in and participate in these kinds of sacred ceremonies. That's certainly a point too. Yeah. So I don't know where that balance is. I just don't know.
I think there's no one rule. One rule for every situation. I think each situation needs to be measured as we go along. I don't think you can have a one size fits all for this.
It's interesting. So as we started the show, Jane, you talked about, again, I want to get back to identity and knowing who you are and having the stability of that center to know who you are in order to know who you are in the world around you. I was wondering if, as third culture people, family, kids, if we could talk a little bit about what makes up a person's identity, if it's uniquely tied to a cultural, identity, or if there are other components to it.
Oh, that's very hard. How long have you got? All day? When I'm talking with families about and students about their cultural identity, I often get them to start with their family's values. So if I'm talking to parents, for example, I will often have them start by looking at their family's values. So their parents, what did they think their parents' family values were, and have they come down to the next generation? And the reason why I think values are important is because when everything else in the world is changing, that is the one constant, because the values are at the very foundation of who we are as individuals, in my opinion, and there's also research to back that up. So that's where I always start, is values, because you can then, if you understand what your values are, then you will be able to connect with another human being, because you have an assurity of who you are as a human being. And then the next layer on top of that, I believe, is the cultural identity. So you need to understand who you are as a human being first.
So did you want to add something to identity, or do you want to think about it for a little bit?
Again, that would be something that you need to think about. I mean, obviously, I do agree with the idea that, in order to understand who you are, or in order to understand another person, you have to understand who you are in relation to that person. And you also have to understand the nuances that can come with differences in culture, differences in lifestyles, and of course in ideologies. You might have a completely different conversation. I don't know. That's a really tough one.
But I'm going to leave you guys with this thought. We're going to take a break now. But before we go to the break, I'm going to leave everybody with this thought. Isn't being a third culture kid also an identity? So we're going to take a short break, and we are going to come back in just a few minutes and continue this conversation. So we'll see you in a few minutes.
Because look at us, like what could we have in common? You can look at all of us and not see it. What unites us is not a visible thing.
My life started in New Haven, Connecticut. Then we moved to Vermont, Sao Paulo, Brazil, Rochester, New York, Bucharest, Romania, Lima, Peru, went to college in Maine. My dad is in education. He runs international American schools.
I was born in Nigeria. I was raised there until I was 13 and went back to the States for 8th grade. I didn't know who Elvis was. I didn't have the right clothes. So I decided when I start high school that I will tell nobody that I have ever been out of the country in my life.
We all grew up in multiple countries or multiple worlds. The reasons are different, and where we grew up is completely different, but we're united by this experience.
Third culture kid is a person who has grown up in a culture that is adopted, is not their passport country, is not where they were born, is not where their parents are from.
I am a confusion of cultures, uniquely me.
You always feel like you have one foot in the door and one foot out the door. There's always going to be that thought of, well, maybe if I moved here, would I feel a little bit more like I belong?
I look like I know what's going on, so people would assume I knew what was going on. And I wouldn't come off as a foreigner who didn't really do that sort of thing. I would come off as an American who wanted to spend time alone.
Nobody talks about what did you lose with an airplane ride. The very airplane rides that other people see as so big and wonderful and important are the very ways that we lost the things we loved.
sure about which part of how I am it relates to this cultural influence or that family experience or this, being a third culture kid.
It's when you're kind of stuck and you think, well, which am I? Am I American, British, Japanese? Maybe where the TCK piece can help you is to say, maybe I don't have to choose, that I am all of these in different ways.
I don't join a group because I want to keep people out. But human beings by nature are exclusive. That's how we are.
I think it's really difficult to sort of understand who you are because of where you've come from.
Who am I? All right, that is a universal question.
So we hope that you enjoyed that video and we had a chance to take a little break behind the scenes too and talk about, there's so many different facets to this topic and many different ways that we can go. But before the break, I did ask the question, isn't being a third culture kid or TCK also an identity? And it's interesting, you may or may not have heard of the term before, but somebody, well, let's just take my son. An example of his situation being from the United States, leaving and being gone for a significant amount of time. And as we read in the introduction, third culture kid identifies specifically being away from your home country for the first 18 years. He's lived eight of those years outside of his home country. So his perspectives are very different. And when we do go back to the United States, people see you as being very, very different than somebody who grew up in LA or grew up in the United States or goes to school. We haven't even talked about the educational aspects yet, which I do want to get into a little bit later. And somebody who actually has a different relationship to fear, right? We're going to get into that right afterwards, but first, what about your identity as a non-American? Or, if we're going to say it, a third culture kid.
I guess the thing that makes the most sense to me is saying that you identify as being a third culture kid kind of means that you don't identify with being anything else. And if that makes sense, if we're talking about the ability to be a cultural chameleon, for example, in order to change and jump from culture to culture and be able to change your perspective and change your identity essentially on the spot, then wouldn't that mean that you would have to not be attached to any certain identity in the first place in order to be able to do that? So for me, I guess kind of a whole third culture kid identity would simply be the non-identification with anything else. That would have to be it. It would be this idea of having a foot in many different worlds and not necessarily, being stuck in any one way of thinking.
But wouldn't one argue that too is an identity?
I suppose so, but it's an identity born from a lack of other identities. So it's in of itself, it's almost an anti-identity, I would say.
Yeah, it's the identity of kind of living everywhere but nowhere, or belonging everywhere but nowhere, isn't it? And that is how we ended up with the third culture kid label, for want of a better word, because we were seeing so many kids who were in the exact place that you've just described, Miro, kind of belonging everywhere but nowhere, and having a foot in multiple cultures. But I think that's okay. Yes, I think we all need to have an identity of some kind. Otherwise, we're just a blank canvas. So I don't see a problem with that. Do you see a problem with that?
No, I don't think it's a bad thing. I was just stating an observation. It's interesting. I wouldn't say it's a bad or a good thing. I don't know if you could really label cultural identity in such an objective way. So.
And I think what's changing now than maybe 50 years ago is there's a greater, as James said in the beginning, a greater understanding of this phenomenon, which means on some levels it's even normalizing it. And the more that we normalize these sorts of third cultures, then we can set up, and people have created communities and those sorts of connections where there are sameness, which gives us also that sense of belonging that everybody on this panel has been talking about. So I want to talk to Ari and Aaron. Do you guys have do you identify with being of third culture kid? I mean, I don't know if you use that term, but not of being, an American, but even though that's your birth country, but of being of the world. I mean, do you identify with this other identity, which is other than?
I would like to say that I would like to identify with that. I feel like sometimes I'm afraid to, almost, with the fear of a reaction from other people, not understanding what that is, not really getting the meaning behind that, like not being able to understand the fact that people can have such an open mind that they can do that, that they don't have to necessarily belong to any one place, and that the world is everyone's home no matter where you are, so I guess being able to say that out loud is something that I wish I could start doing more.
I feel like we have gone to so many different places, but we have been in America the longest.
Yeah, definitely.
And we have had multiple permanent houses in America.
Yes, we have.
Well, for permanent houses.
They didn't. Obviously not permanent.
But
yes.
In other places, we visited in Airbnbs, stayed in hotels.
Yes, which felt like home at the time.
It felt like home.
Definitely felt like home at the time.
But eventually we've left those places.
And then you never leave. You never leave memories, obviously. And I don't want to leave the feeling of belonging there, I guess. Like if we ever go back, I want to, feel the same way I felt while we were living there, even though we might not stay for the same time, we might not stay as long, or we might stay longer, but always being able to say that wherever you are, you belong, I suppose, in the world, everywhere, is a good thing to be able to say. And it opens you up to a lot of cultures and a lot of ideas that can change who you are as a person. And that can make your identity, I suppose.
Yes, Ari, I absolutely loved what you said when you said the world is everyone's home. I think, yes, absolutely. If only we could all embrace that as a concept and as a value, base value. So that is absolutely brilliant. I want to pick up on two things that you spoke about. The first one is the fear that you spoke of embracing a multicultural, multi-space cultural identity. Are you saying that comes from fear of people's reactions, or fear of the fact that your family as in your parents and grandparents and extended family are American and would be mortified to hear that you don't identify as an American or a Californian. Can you elaborate on that a little bit for me, please?
I do believe it's definitely more of the first. It's more other people's reactions. I love my parents and they love traveling as much as we do. Of course, obviously, my mom is the one that has dragged us to all these places. And I'm not complaining, of course. But it's definitely more the first. When you stay in places for long periods of time, you meet people who have been there their entire lives and sometimes haven't even like stepped foot out of their county, much less their country. And if you say to them that you don't identify as any, singular, you don't personally identify with any singular place, then I suppose I personally kind of feel like might be like offending them and their way of life, I suppose. The fact that they're staying in one place and that they think they belong to that place, if they think that. And if I say that I don't feel like I belong to any place, then I feel almost like disconnected from that person, where I obviously have something huge that we don't have in common.
Can I add something, Ari?
Yeah. Sorry, I'm rambling all the time.
We have many, many friends who the thought of leaving the home they've lived in their whole years is so terrifying. They don't even want to think about moving.
Yeah.
So then when they meet us and we've moved all over and we just moved in.
Yeah, it's really scary for other
hard
people.
for them because we even had a friend, I won't say their name, but their mom, they wanted to travel so much. They wanted to be like us. They wanted to travel. And then their parents actually disconnected them from us because they have lived there forever
and didn't want
to move
their child thinking about moving far away from them.
We are no longer in touch with them.
Yeah, sadly,
they were good friends.
They were really good friends,
but just the thought to the parents of their daughter moving away from them one day, or making them move,
or becoming someone that they weren't kind of being, I don't want to say bred, but like
they were making them into a housewife
kind of thing, and they didn't want them to be exposed to any other culture. They wanted them to grow up in one specific way and not be exposed to any cultures. And for me, that's really sad because I love all the cultures that I feel that I'm a part of. And just explaining to people, I think that like it's okay not to belong to any one place is scary for me because I feel like it, disconnects you from some people, and scary to them because I feel like it disconnects us from them the same way. Yeah.
I simply wanted to add that I think that when you voice your own identity, naturally it has to come from a place of having the other person's reaction in mind. Because I personally know who I am. I know my ideologies. I know my values. That's unspoken. That doesn't need to be said. So I think that whenever I make the choice to materialize and to manifest that identity, to manifest that point of view, it has to come from a place of awareness of the other person involved in the conversation. That was my thought.
Yes, I think awareness is absolutely key, Miro, absolutely. going back to one point you made earlier, Ari and Aaron, you were talking about some of the places that you've been to and those families, that was home and that was where they were going to stay. You also mentioned that when you are traveling around the world, those places that you are in at that time are home for you. Can you expand on that for me? What is it that gives you that sense of home? And Miro, I really value your opinion here too, because you are obviously traveling around the world. It's clearly not the bricks and mortar that we're talking about here. So can you elaborate a little bit about what home is for you?
Well, I mean, the cheesy answer would be to say home is family to us. And that's true. I mean,
It's very true.
We always travel together. We always travel with our parents to all these places, and we try our hardest to make sure that our life doesn't change per se, depending on where we are. Like, we always are the same people. We always, act as ourselves, no matter where we are. So there's this kind of feeling of, I guess, safety in knowing that you can be yourself wherever you are. And truthfully, for me, that's what the definition of home is being able to be yourself in a... I'm sorry. I
add something?
Like joking, I'm sorry. In like a safe environment with people that you enjoy being around. Yeah, and that it's just always better when you're in a fun place, even a place you've never been to before, because then you can make it home.
I just want to add one thing. We have friends that we have met all across the entire world.
Yeah.
Through all our travels that we, for some of them, haven't seen for years in person, but we keep in touch using the internet.
Yeah, the internet is a very valuable
So no
tool
matter
in trying
where
to
we
keep
go,
friends.
we have our friends we can talk to.
Yeah.
And we have our family.
Yeah, friends, family, and
pets.
Sometimes
we know
pets.
We have our pets.
Yes, which count as family. But definitely, I think, it depends on what your definition of home is. For me, that's home. So having that wherever I am is, I guess, important for making the wherever we are feel like home.
Yeah, this word authenticity is coming up over and over again, isn't it, in our conversation today. Somewhere, home for you is somewhere where you can be who you are. You can be your authentic self. It's a safe place for you. That's fantastic. Miro, I'd love to hear your opinion.
I would definitely agree with the statement that home is family. In my life, that has essentially been the only stable thing that I've ever needed. But I would also say that this also goes back into an identity thing for me too, because I don't know, I personally get a kick out of telling people that I'm homeless. And it's true. It basically is true. Although I like to use the phrase houseless. But it's interesting because it also brings up this whole idea of, well, in order to, if you want to believe that the entire world is your home, in a sense, that also kind of makes you homeless. So it's kind of like that duality of that mind frame. I don't know. I think it's interesting because if we're talking simply in the material, home is, the suitcases that we lug around, the 2 suitcases that we live out of. But it's really much more than that. I think, if anything, home is acceptance. And it has to be. Home is a place of acceptance or a moment of acceptance. It doesn't even have to be a geographical location. I like to think that moments in time and memories can also be home. So.
What's interesting? Go ahead.
Sorry, Lainey, I was actually going to ask you what your opinion of home is, because you've identified yourself as a third culture adult. you have obviously had some period in your life when you have had a home base per se. Now, in 2017, how would you describe home?
Probably in the same way that my son would describe it, actually. And to me, it's really interesting that, I don't think I've ever been asked that question directly. It's always about, how are you, mom, providing a stable environment for your son? So I'm going to answer both questions. As a parent, how do I provide a stable environment for my child? I provide a stable environment for my child through attachment. And so I've been a proponent of and an advocate for attachment parenting. And still at 18 years, we're quite attached, and meaning that we feel safe and secure in the relationship, in the authenticity, and in the world around us. And we have this platform, which is our relationship, to voice those things that come up that don't make us feel safe, but we have that environment to be able and the environment is not a brick and mortar place. It's not a house. The environment is the relationship. So we're traveling with our relationship. And for me, my role as the parent who's been traveling with their child for the last 8 years, or living in different countries, because I'm here in one place, 3 years in another, 6 months here, that's really living in different places. The country itself, to me, was secondary in terms of identity, and what we brought was this sense of home and stability with us. So a little bit different, I think. And then to answer your question, what is my perspective of home? That's it. However, now being a parent to an 18-year-old, and those child traveling days may be coming to an end at some point, from that perspective of identity, not home, but identity, that shifting, that what I found in the world and the stability of home wherever I was, I can find that anywhere because I brought it with me. But the identity of traveling with my child is going to shift at some point. Yeah. I hope that answers your question. And what about you, Jane? Because you also are the parent of third culture kids, and not only do you work in transitions for others, it's your personal experience as well.
Yes, that's true. And everything that you guys have said is exactly the same in my situation as well. And for us, so we've just recently repatriated back to Australia, which was not our plan A. Our plan A was to continue travelling, but we felt like we needed to come back for our boys' education. That's another story. But what we have identified, so I'm a mum to 2 teenage boys, they're 17 and 14, and what we have identified is our family unit is home. And exactly as Ari said before, they were almost word for word the phrase that my boys identified when they said it's a place where we don't have to explain ourselves. It's where we can be who we are. We can just be. Was my 14-year-old's phrase, and I think. And I love that. So, for example, if I tell you a brief story, when we first moved back to Australia, we went on a holiday. We were all a bit frazzled, getting used to being back here again. And we went on a holiday, and we knew that the place where we were going to in North Queensland was very safe. So we said to them, okay, on the first morning, okay, here's the key to the apartment. Off you go and explore and, have a great time. And they both looked at us and said, no, we want to be where you are. We want to do this together. And that's the way that we'd always done it while we were living overseas. We'd done things together. And they said, it's not the same if we're doing it on our own. We want to be together. And I think that's what home is for us. It's our family unit. And even now, our eldest son has gone to boarding school. And so he's just home often just for one day in the weekend. And he always wants us to go and do something together as a family, the four of us. So it's about being real and being authentic together for us as well. So we're all on the same page there.
Yeah, thank you for adding that. And actually that inspires the real last topic that I really want to dive into. This is a show about education, and so I really want to touch on the educational aspects. Number one, how does identity somehow relate to learning and thus education? And the second is, are there any challenges that a third culture kid may have in terms of being a student and a learner because of their status that would make that would give them more challenges than perhaps somebody who is not? Also, the answer may not be challenges. It may give them more advantages. So I'm curious to hear from everybody's perspective. And also the interesting thing is, Jean, that you work in education and you work in more formal education, and the teens that are on the panel are all self-directed learners. So I know that about the style of education being different. So I'd like to hear all the different perspectives. And I can also speak from the perspective of a parent supporting a third culture self-directed kid too. But why don't we go to Ari and Aaron first, and then we'll go around.
All right. Well, one thing definitely about education that we both agree on is
kids in schools in America or in anywhere, just classic schools, read books about what we've done in real life.
Yeah, which is what I love. Like,
we've gone to Greece. We've seen the Alamo. We've been in the Alamo.
Yeah.
Other people have read about it.
Yeah, and I love
a history book that has been changed by how they see it.
How you can flip to a page in a history book and point to a thing and then say, yeah, we can go there. That's what I love. And then you have a real reason to remember that, not just, for a test or something, or to write it down for notes or anything. Like, you really feel a connection because you have, physically been there, and it's really a different experience than it is, looking through pages.
If reading about people who have immigrated to different countries, it won't affect you. If you read about it in a book, you'll be like, cool, that happened. If you've gone there and helped out and seen them.
Yes, if you've met people.
And have a personal connection with them.
Then you'll remember it more than you will.
You will never forget that experience.
Yes, definitely. It's hard to forget experiences than it is words on a page, I would say.
Oh, yes, I 100% agree with you on that. And the experiences that you guys are having outweigh anything, absolutely. And the way that you guys are learning, and you're self-directed learning, the way you're going about it is such a vital life skill. I couldn't agree more with you. Going back to the question you were asking, Lainey, about how identity impacts on the way that you learn, when you are reading a book, getting back to the book, you bring your own cultural knowledge and your prior experience to understanding and interpreting the text that you're working with. So, for example, I totally refuse to go and see some of the movies that have been made from books. And the reason why I do that, well, actually, it came from a long time ago. Tolkien always said, don't ever go and see a movie based on any of the books that I have written. And I get it now because I have such vivid images in my mind of the characters, of the settings, of the complications, whatever it may be, based on my cultural knowledge and my prior experience, which you guys will have as well, because you have lived so much and experienced so much, and you bring that cultural lens with you. So I think that is absolutely gold, priceless, as a matter of fact. What do you think, Miriam?
I'm going to say that I completely agree with the experiential learning thing as well. And I think that experiential learning definitely does make learning more profound. But as a good friend of mine who always says, or he's a Tai Chi teacher, and whenever he teaches his classes, he always says, empty your cup. And that's a philosophy that he has. He says, in order to truly learn something, you have to forget everything that you came with to begin with. You have to learn it, from an empty state. Empty your cup. Empty all the knowledge that you had out before. Come with an open mind. Come with a fresh perspective. And I definitely agree with that. And it goes back into the whole, again, the cultural chameleon thing. By being able to exercise that ability, I'm able to shed any label that I so want. So many people, for example, let's just say, like, if you come with this very religious mindset, you might not learn about mysticism. Or if you come from a very patriotic place, you might not learn about politics in the places that you visit. And by being able to drop all of these ideas and all these self-identifications of labels, it opens me up to have an authentic experience. I empty the cup. I forget everything that I know beforehand, and I learn it from people who are willing to teach it to me. I learn it from my experiences and my exposures. So I don't know. That's it.
Wow. Thank you so much. You have just really explained a whole fresh perspective that I've not really thought about before. So thank you. That's brilliant.
So I want to play devil's advocate just a little bit. Earlier this year, we worked with a group of students from Asia, and all of them, the majority of them, were third culture kids. They were a group of students from Hong Kong, and they were from other countries. And one of the kids that we worked with was from the UK that lived in Hong Kong, that came from a family that was broken, and he did not have any of those attachments that we talked about before. And so with this challenge, first of all, his home base is kind of shattered, and they didn't have that stable, ground that we're talking about, our home that comes with us everywhere. And being in another culture that is not his own presents bigger challenges that then are spilling out into the perceived learning. So I'm wondering, Jane, maybe because you work with kids that are in similar, or have worked, I'm assuming you've worked with kids that have been in similar situations. I wonder if you could talk about some of the added hurdles and perhaps, because this is the challenges part. We've just seen from Miro and from Ari and Aaron some of the actual benefits. So I'm wondering if we can flip the card a little bit and talk about some of those challenges that might even compound a person's ability to learn or produce in a setting, in an educational learning setting.
Yeah, absolutely. There are a few challenges that are associated with living this globally mobile life, moving around quite a lot. The first one, from a learning perspective, is possibly the most obvious one, which is the academics. And this is if I'm talking about going from one form of formal education to another form of formal education. I guess that's one of the benefits of self-directed learning, is that you don't have to fit into any particular curriculums. But if you are in formal education, then what is offered in one curriculum may not be offered in another. One of the real challenges that comes with that is, will my current knowledge be valued in this new environment? And will I ever catch up is the other thing. Is this going to be something that is it's a constant thing that keeps happening. One of the other things that quite often can go on is when people are moving from one culture to another is the stress that it's on the family. The family you mentioned just before from Hong Kong, for example, the stress that places on that child, and can also often manifest physically. Stomach cramps, headaches, memory loss is a big one. There's quite a bit of research coming out now about memory loss being linked to kids who move around a lot, because it's full on moving to a new environment. You are trying to make new friends. You are also trying to manage your learning. You're trying to adapt to the culture. I mean, gosh, that takes a lot of brain power. It takes a lot of heart. It takes a lot of soul. It's exhausting. And so add in the cultural fatigue that comes with that. And it has to have an impact, doesn't it? Absolutely.
I've never heard the term cultural fatigue before. That's interesting. Can you talk a little bit about that and maybe then reflect with the rest of the panel to see if it's something that, since I've never heard the term, something that we've all sort of experienced in one way or another?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. Well, it's really, it comes about because kids are trying to keep so many balls in the air. Mum and dad or parents, other members of the family, are also trying to keep all the balls in the air. The the practicalities of moving to a new location and adjusting to that new location. It's just so all-consuming when you are adjusting to a new culture or learning the nuances of a new culture. And so cultural fatigue is really just the exhaustion that's associated with that. So I'd be interested to know if moving to a new culture or adjusting to a new culture, if this is something that you experience or whether you are emboldened by it.
Well, for sure, there's no doubt that when you're moving to a new culture with language differences, there is the fatigue of trying to communicate and not feel heard or feel effective with your own communication. So I can understand and have clearly experienced that kind of cultural fatigue when we first started traveling in Latin America, not speaking a word of Spanish. So, and don't say it. He usually says you still know, but yeah, my son has become fluent and I still speak very basic, but that's a whole nother topic. But the cultural fatigue, I completely identify with and understand. Do you have any experience?
I haven't experienced it to a point where it would really affect my well-being, but I definitely can agree. Yes, for sure. Whenever you go to a new place, you definitely do experience some kind of cultural barrier, whether that's a very minor thing or whether it's a very large thing. And that's something that can be experienced even if you travel just to the next town over. Like it's something that slight. But if we're talking to the extent that it would like really start to affect you, no, I haven't experienced it. But I totally understand it. Cultural barriers are a real thing.
Miro, I have a question for you. I'm just thinking about formal education versus the way that you guys are doing your education, which I totally applaud. How do you connect with other kids your age? And the reason why I'm asking this question is because one of the things that contributes to cultural fatigue is often the emotional elements of saying goodbye to people at one school. This is in the formal school setting, one school, and trying to meet friends at a new school whilst you're still grieving the loss of the friends that you've left. And actually Aaron and Ari have spoken a lot about friends they've met along the way. So Miro, how do you socialise with kids your own age given that you are not in a formal school situation?
That's a very interesting question. I've got a lot of friends, most of which are actually online in different countries. So I'm up most nights pretty late actually just to communicate with them due to the time difference. But I would also say it can be tough for sure. I definitely do notice a difference between my interactions with school children and with self-directed learners as well. I don't know. I think if anything, it just comes from a place of less understanding. Like it's harder for me to relate to children who have actually gone through a more formal educational path. And that's not to say I have a lot of friends who have gone through the traditional schooling path. But for the most part, I definitely do struggle more with those kids than my peers.
And that would also be another cultural identity that he
Definitely.
carries, which is not just third culture by going into another country. It means that not only does he go into another country, but yet his educational experience is very different than those in that country as well. And it's very different than the majority, the majority, not all, but the majority of the kids from his home country too. So it makes his group or community much smaller, although we've got Ari and Aaron, who are also part of the same sort of educational philosophy, and so their community in that sense. Do you guys want to talk about your social interactions?
Well, one thing I would say right off the bat is we've both been in traditional education in schools. We've been in a lot of different schools, like all across the U.S., and it's been very different experiences in each, and we've made very different friends in each. But as soon as you leave that, one thing you realize is that once you're not being, kind of forced to hang around kids your own age for, 5 to 6.5 hours every single day, it doesn't really matter what age people are, as long as you have things in common with them, as long as you can, hold conversations with them. And it depends on your age as well. Like I know my little sister is 6, so whenever we get to a new place, as long as there's another little kid, she can just run up and say, hey, do you want to play tag? And they'll play for hours. Whereas as for me personally, as long as like I can connect with people and have something in common with them, that I can hold a discussion with them, I don't care about what age they are or what form of education they have or anything like that, as long as I'm sure if that same person was in a traditional like education, like in a school, and I met them, I would probably also enjoy their company, but that doesn't mean that I would not talk to them if they're not my age, or if they're not if they don't come from the same background as me or something like that.
I'd like to add one thing to that. Not only in public school you're forced to be around people who are your age, but you're also forced to not be around people any older. All times are different. If you're playing or recess at the same time, you take breaks at the wrong time. So there's no way you can have a friend in even one grade above or one grade below.
I do not remember at any point
you're never able to meet with them.
During any time at my time personally, at any of the schools that we've been to, having really talked to anyone outside of one of the 4 classes or so in the grade that I was in, and it was kind of discouraging. We always went to really quite large schools that had a lot of different kids, and we started traveling and doing doing our own forms of education when I was about to be the last grade in the school that we were in. So I never really, experienced going all the way through a school. I never stayed with the same people for more than a year. And I wish I had the chance to meet more people during that time, because I feel like the people that I had to stay with for my times at like a public school were in a really forced environment, I guess. like we were always in the middle of class, and they always discourage talking to other people during a class. Like there's always the like, you shouldn't talk during class or you'll get in trouble. Yeah, it's disruptive. You're not allowed to talk to people, yet you're supposed to stay next to them for 6.5 hours, 5 days a week for the majority of the year. And then and then we're asked how we make friends.
Yeah.
In situations where we're able to talk to people of, any background, any age, whenever we're able to, and really, connect about anything other than schoolwork. Because as soon as that's done, you want to leave the house and you can run around, or you do whatever you do in your free time, because you don't have to sit and do homework, because technically all of your work is homework.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing your perspective. That's really interesting to hear that. One thing, Lainey, that you were talking about was the unschooled movement that you're a part of, your self-directed learning, is a minority. You're a minority group, for want of a better word. How do you think being a minority impacts the way that you guys view the world?
Yeah, that's actually huge, and because we see the world through a different lens, and I know the lens that we see the world is colored through those commitments to be self-directed learners, unschoolers. And I know that, for us, it's a very, very positive in every aspect of our lives, in terms of being present, in terms of being open, in terms of using the empty your cup technique. All of these other things allow us to go and live our lives being very, very present, always absorbing and learning. However, I would say that it does not come without its challenges. For example, living in Peru. We lived in Peru for 3 years in Cusco in the Andes. And the culture that we lived in was not just typical Spanish, it was a Quechua, which means that the folks that are living in the Andes, in the mountains, are not direct descendants from the people that colonized from Spain. These are the indigenous people. And for them, they've had 500 years of colonialization, and the understanding that the only way for them, this is their cultural perspective, and whether I agree with it or not is not really the point, but their belief system is that education is the only way for them to move into a life of meaning, whether it's wealth or economic independence or any of the things that are tied with that. Their belief system, one of the core cultural baseline beliefs, is education is the direct ladder to ascend to a better life. We all want a better life. There's a lot of commonalities. We all want the same things. We want connection. We want health. We want, a roof over our head. We want food. There are simple things that give us this commonality. And when Miro and I go to different cultures, and especially when we lived for 3 years in this culture, our friends were Quechua, our friends were Mezcla. Some of them were Spanish mixture from Lima, from the capital, that, and some, it was a big mix of people, but the predominant culture is the Quechua people. And for them to look at us through their worldview as a mother who perhaps in their mind is privileged because I come from another country and can afford to go to their country. Doesn't mean I have money, but in their mind, privilege, and not giving my son a quote unquote formal education was something that they couldn't reconcile, something they couldn't understand. And as much as we talked about why we had made those choices. Still, for them, it was, okay, I hear you, head shake, walk away. And it was always on respect. It was with respect, but I understood that telling them one time was not going to be a meeting of the minds, but living side by side with them and living with integrity and authenticity and living with somebody who is extremely educated, showing them that helped change or soften their worldview just a little bit. But on the other hand, there are those challenges. One of the challenges was, Miro, I remember being 14 years old and saying, I have no friends. And I said to him, and this is going back to your original question, I said to him, but there's all these beautiful children around you. Why are you not engaging? And yes, there are cultural differences. There's cultural differences that were very, very, obvious. But my perspective was, hey, people are people and we're kids and let's just hang out and talk. But Miro's objection was not that they were potato farmers, but that they didn't have the commonality to talk about poetry and philosophy and mythology and the things that he was interested in. So, wherever you are on the spectrum of education and whatever your circumstance is as a third culture family, there are challenges, and I would never attempt to gloss over anybody's situation. And I want to just make it clear that we have had challenges, and I don't know what the right answer is, and I don't know how to solve those problems.
And I think also to add on to what she said, one of the biggest challenges, which is something that no teenager really needs more of, is coming from a place of always being misunderstood as well, being this self-directed learner. Because regardless, whenever people, even before they interact with you, they just see you. They say, oh, that's a young person, that is some sort of student, and this is my automatic preconception that I have of this person. And it's just simply wrong. And having to come from a place of not really defending, but just explaining my life. It can be a challenge. It certainly can be a challenge, always having to address situations like that, having to kind of justify, to people who simply don't understand. So, it's a challenge for sure, but it is what it is.
Yeah, and actually, I'm shocked that 2 hours have almost already flown by. And so what I'd like to do is I'd like to go around to each of our panelists and give you the opportunity to share any closing thoughts, whether it's reflections on your own experiences or reflections from today's show, or perhaps even words of advice to somebody who may be either living in fear or stepping over the threshold to becoming a third culture family now, and something that may help them as they're wrapping up watching these 2 hours. So who would like to jump in first? I don't want to call on. Okay. All right. Go ahead.
Well, first off, as I would like to say for I suppose one part of the fear portion of it is there's nothing wrong with belonging to more than one place at a time. There's definitely no reason to leave your own culture behind. There's no reason at all to think that traveling will change you as a person. It could, and it might, but that's nothing to be scared of. You can keep your beliefs and still travel, and who knows, you might, be able to open your mind to new things, and that's nothing to be scared of. Yeah.
All right. One thing I would like to add is a lot of people who we've ever told that we are full-time travelers, they have said, and I quote from one person, "I'd love to do that maybe if I win the lottery."
Yeah.
And I have to say, you don't have to do that in order to travel.
No, you don't.
You can be a traveler just like you are right now. All you have to do is get the courage to do it.
Yeah.
And take that final step over the line.
Yeah, you could, even start out by, traveling to the next town over, maybe staying for a few days. I mean, that's a new experience, even if you've been there before, because you're not constantly there. You can travel to the next state, to the next, county, to the next wherever. And, that's a step in any direction. You can immediately decide never to do it again. And I'm going to say personally, that's a horrible decision because there's nothing wrong about, stepping outside your comfort zone for a little bit. It just makes you realize, I guess, what your comfort zone is. And the more you push it, the wider it becomes and the more you're open to and are willing to experience.
Man, you guys are amazing. You have just kind of summed it up all in one statement. So absolutely, yeah, brilliant. And your life experience is obviously impacting on you in such a positive way, which is outstanding. A couple of things I'd just like to say is that I think the development of identity is a lifelong thing. I don't think you get to the age of 18 and you've got to have it all sorted, or otherwise your life's going to be a basket case. I don't subscribe to that at all. I think it is a lifelong journey to getting to a point where you know who you are as a person. But along the way, there are things that you can do that can really cement you in that place and in that time. And we've talked about them. We've talked about the values with our family values. We've talked about being authentic human beings and living with integrity. And I think that they are just such core values for society in general. And I believe that students and families crossing cultures can be and need to be the cultural bridge between worlds. We are living in a world right now where there's a lot of division, and you guys are the next generation. You guys are the keys to us living a peaceful life. I totally agree with that. You have a global perspective, you have a cultural understanding and an awareness that is being developed in whether you are moving from one town to the other, as you said, Aria, or from one nation to another. And I think the positives far outweigh the negatives, but it needs to be managed well. And that would be my main statement, is that unmanaged mobility is what causes the problems, the negative implications. But managed mobility is full of amazing opportunities and can enhance and activate learning, and you guys are prime examples of that.
I think the whole thing that comes with the travel and kind of, what Erin brought up of I wish I could do that, that kind of smugness. I think a part of that really stems from people not willing to reevaluate their own values. And what I mean by that is, really all it takes to live this lifestyle is a shift in your mindset, a shift in your paradigm. We live hand to mouth. We don't have the luxuries of, a stationary life. And that's totally fine by us, because we realized early on that that's not really important to us, that doesn't have nearly as much value as authentic experiences and collecting experiences over things. So I think what I would say to that is just really think about what you want and, reevaluate your life after that point. So.
I'm so inspired by everybody on this panel. Absolutely. Thank you so much. And it's been an incredible 2 hours. And can you believe how quickly it flew by? Wow, what an amazing conversation. Before we wrap up, I just want to remind everybody to go to the show notes page in order to find everybody's links. And I want to thank Nina, who produced the show. You did an amazing job, as always, putting together an interesting panel. My goodness. This has been really, really incredible. And thank you to Mel and Biggie over at Conscious Consumer Network. We are eternally grateful for the past 2.5 years of being able to broadcast on your network these ideas. And we look forward to 2.5 years more. So wherever you are and whatever you do, we ask you to continue doing it for the love of learning.
If we want to change the world, we must first change the media. Mainstream media exists for the purposes of indoctrination and manipulation of public perception. The world of free and independent media is growing, and with the upsurge in information now available in the public domain, it has never been easier to access free and independent media. The exploration of this information resulted in an experimental project which would provide a fully supported space for researchers, whistleblowers, and seekers of all kinds to express themselves and educate the world. On the 1st of January 2015, Conscious Consumer Network was launched to the world. Nobody thought we would make it this far, but CCN is the longest running free and independent media network of its kind. CCN is a unique collaboration of hearts and souls, bringing you information from different perspectives to educate and inform. Since we started CCN, we have had only one desire, the pursuit of a free, fair, just, sustainable world, and this has not changed. Having overcome many challenges over the last 2 years, CCN is here to stay, and we've got great things lined up for 2017. Help keep CCN on the air by supporting the 2017 Network Support Fund.